Our next session is action-packed, creative strategies for social change. While some fight power through illegal acts, others fight power through everyday subtle protests. Our next speaker has spent the past 2 decades fighting international human rights and telling stories about Burma, Cambodia, HIV/AIDS, and many other stories. Today, he will share the anatomy of change and how we can create movements, campaigns, and actions. Please welcome John Jackson.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is the worst slot because you've all just eaten, so if I hear snoring, I'll assume it wasn't me and it was your sushi, right? So I've only got 20 minutes. This is going to be more the skeleton rather than the whole anatomy of change in that amount of time. But I'll try and get through as much as I can, which gives, I think, the nuts and bolts of what campaigners look at when they're trying to develop movements or campaigns or actions. So I'm going to talk about change, but I'm going to talk about the specific change that is driven by movements, by campaigns, and by actions, as opposed to other forms of change that takes place in our societies, whether that's cultural, technological, economic, political. And I'm going to start with movements. What I want to do is talk about the most common elements you'll find in the most successful or the most influential movements. And the key starting point, if this works, do I need to point this at anything in order to? No? The key starting point for most movements is vision and story. It's a projection of what the world will be like, or what the issue will be like, if the movement succeeds. So a clear, articulated, and usually positive vision of the change that they want. And it's driven by story. So people can see themselves in that vision. It's told in narratives, sometimes with multiple stories. Martin Luther King never talked about his 20-point plan for the world. He kept on talking about his dream, and so did other members of the civil rights movement. And people could see themselves. It was an inclusive dream. People could see themselves in it, and they could buy into that vision of the future, which also then broadened the possibility for support of his movement. It included people who weren't directly affected by segregation in the southern states of America. The other key things that movements very much focus on is their membership and action. They know who their members are, they know what their members are willing to do and are likely to do, and they generate action. And more so these days, the members of the movement generate the action also. There's a really nice story from Poland during the early 1980s when Poland was still a communist regime. And Solidarity, the big social movement in Poland, was banned. But you had Radio Solidarity, which was also banned. And they used to broadcast every night, but they didn't know how many people were listening to them. And so one night, one cold, dark winter's night in Warsaw, at the end of their broadcast, they said, if you're listening to us, switch your lights on and off. And apparently Warsaw that night was like a giant Christmas tree. Thousands upon thousands of people in their apartments and in their homes flicked their light switches on and off. And that was a really interesting action because, especially in the working class districts of Warsaw, union workers, union members were arrested, were beaten, were brutalized. This was a way that they could take an action. They could say to Solidarity, we support you. They could say to the regime, we resist you, and they could do it in the safety of their own homes. So it was a very, very well thought out action, and especially under dictatorship, one of the key things for dictatorships is that they try and make people feel isolated. You don't know who thinks the same as you because there's secret police, it's dangerous to talk. So it was a perfect action for people to feel truly a sense of solidarity. The actions that are generated by the movement need to be varied. There needs to be a broad repertoire of tactics because you need freshness in the approach that you're taking to the issues, and there needs to be a sense of momentum and forward direction. So it's really important to be varied. If you keep on doing the same thing all the time, you're going to lose people. They also need to be responsive. You can have a plan, a very well thought out plan, but if the news overtakes events, and if people are talking about other things, you kind of become less relevant. So it's very important to make sure that if there is something happening in the world and if everyone's already talking about it, you might as well use that as an opportunity to shift that conversation towards your agenda and the things that that you want people to talk about, that your movement is concerned about. So it's important to jump on that news cycle where it's relevant. The other key thing is humor. Humor is a really important part of activism. And especially when you want people to do things that have never done something before, whether that's in a democracy or whether that's in under a dictatorship. Humor removes fear. When people laugh, almost just as a physiological change, it removes fear. It also punctures authority. So humor is very important. There's a really nice story from Burma where after yet another violent crackdown against peaceful protesters, it was too dangerous for humans to protest. And so the activists in Rangoon recruited the stray dogs of the city. And these dogs became fantastic democracy activists, right? So in Burma, if you want to insult someone, you associate them with a dog. You call them a dog, you call them a son of a dog. It's unfortunate for dogs in the culture, but if you want to insult someone, you call them a dog. And so the activists got these stray dogs, and they basically put portrait photographs of the senior generals in the regime around the dogs' necks. So these dogs were running through the city, and they were living, breathing, salivating, smelly insults, right, against this regime. But what made it more farcical is that people sitting in tea shops and on the streets could see troops, soldiers who had just weeks before shot people, had been ordered to go and remove the photographs from these dogs. So troops were running after the dogs throughout the city, and it gave everyone a laugh. So humor is quite an important aspect of activism. Targets need to be resonant. Now, I don't know why I chose this one. I just like this picture of Putin. And he's probably one of the most difficult targets on all the issues that he's creating. But the targets need to be meaningful, they need to be recognizable, and they need to make sense to the people involved in the movement and in the campaign. And this is an obvious one, but it's a really important one. Identity and symbols. A sense of identity for both the members of the movement, a sense of identity of the movement itself, and symbols that express both the vision and the values. And I think Occupy has been one of the most recent examples of a very powerful meme, identity meme, where millions of people around the world in so many different countries, in so many different cultural contexts, could immediately see themselves and identify as being part of that 99%. Then the other thing, which is one of the absolutely most fundamentally important things, but one of the things that is kind of one of the most difficult aspects of movements, is that they are sustained and that they're united. Movements need infrastructure, they need resources, they need a community of people who are willing to be there for the long haul. Systemic change, unfortunately, takes a long time, and it's not short and it's not quick. So being able to sustain the movement is really critical, and being united, or at the very least being cohesive, so that often the challenges, the obstacles to the change you want, they're kind of determined and they're persistent and they're well organized and they're usually well funded. So if you're not able to sustain your movement and if you're not able to be united, then your chances of shifting things really fundamentally are going to be limited. So those are the kind of the core elements you most usually see in successful, influential movements. And the building blocks of the movements are usually multiple campaigns. So if we were to think of it in this way, the civil rights movement in the US was the movement. The Montgomery bus boycott would have been the campaign, and carpooling would have been the action. So we're talking about the campaign level now. There's 7 ingredients, and I'm going to use an example from Burma that I worked on in the Burma campaign in the UK. In any campaign, you have to know what is your aim? What is the simple single thing that you want to change? And in this case, it was very straightforward. British American Tobacco, that owns Rothmans and 555 and Lucky Strike, had a joint venture business with the dictatorship in Burma. They had a cigarette factory in Burma. So the aim was very simple: to make British American Tobacco leave Burma. In a campaign, you have to choose a target. We were lucky because this guy is called Kenneth Clarke. He's one of the most famous conservative politicians in the UK. He was Margaret Thatcher's finance minister, but he was also on the board of British American Tobacco, and he was still a sitting MP. So he was a great target. Everyone knew who he was, and he's kind of an affable rogue, so he's got a lot of presence in the media. The third thing for a campaign is, what are your objectives? And for us as campaigners, objectives are the incremental steps that you need to achieve in order to reach your ultimate aim. And so one of our objectives was to associate British American Tobacco and its brands with the dictatorship in Burma. So this guy here is a Burmese friend of mine. This is the offices that we had. There was just 4 of us in an office. Some of our potted plants were included in the photograph. And we just did Photoshop of British American brands on his uniform. So we wanted to associate the company with the dictatorship. We wanted to dominate the news agenda, any news about the company, whether it was the annual meeting, whether it was the business results. We wanted to make Burma the story. We wanted to divide the board. We knew that there was a difference of opinion on the board of the company. So we wanted to try and find ways of putting wedges between company directors. And we wanted to feed journalists and politicians and others with the kinds of information we were getting from Burma on the ground, from the illegal underground union movement, who were giving us, information on labor conditions and how the factory was built, because it was built using forced labor and child labor. Is this? So our tactics were basically connected to those objectives. We went to the annual general meeting of the company. We had guys dressed as Burmese soldiers outside. We bought shares in the company, so we were part owners. We bought Burmese human rights defenders from Thailand to London, and they were shareholders too. So we went to the meeting and we dominated all of the questions to the board of British American Tobacco on the issue of Burma and the human rights abuses that its business partner was committing. We also fed board business journalists who love a scandal, because this is the kind of scandal that they don't get to write about too much. So that was useful as well. And we used the allies really well. By the end of the campaign, the British government was calling for British American Tobacco to leave Burma, which was kind of unusual. Big investment funds in the City of London, investment funds that owned part of the company, but that managed assets of about, I think it was £400 billion, also publicly called for British American Tobacco to leave Burma. So we used the alliances very, very well. And before we started the campaign, which is a really critical preparatory stage, is to understand what resources you have. What are your financial resources? Who are the people who will volunteer and help you run the campaign? Who are the allies who you can leverage, who can do a lot of the amplification and pressure for you? It's all critical to know that, because you don't want to launch a campaign, use all your resources, and then that's it. You go out in a very quick blast, and then nothing else happens, because then your targets are going to kind of know that fairly quickly. They'll just hold tight, and you'll just dissipate into the ether and be ineffective. And so once we knew our resources, we planned our actions. We knew what actions we were going to take for a good 6 months ahead. We knew we could do actions beyond 6 months, but we knew we were going to take them every 2 to 3 weeks. And we were going to just continue to raise the heat, apply the pressure, and make the cost of operating in Burma for British American Tobacco to just be too expensive. And so after 11 months, when we launched the campaign, British American Tobacco said they will never leave Burma, and after 11 months, they pulled out. So that's just an example of the structural thinking as campaigners we go through when we're thinking of launching a campaign, and all the things that we consider. And you're just using Burma as an example. And within a campaign, and this is kind of the final part, within a campaign are single actions. And again, this is the skeleton. A lot more goes into the thinking, but this is the real nuts and bolts essentials. And there's 4 prime ingredients. And I'm going to use an example from the Syria campaign, which I was working with in April. And they launched a campaign around aid to Syria. So in any thinking about an action, the first question is, what is the problem, or what is the crisis? And this was as much of a crisis as you can imagine. There were 3 million Syrians within the borders of Syria in need of food and medical aid, which they weren't getting. The opportunity or for anyone who watches The Simpsons, the crisis-opportunity of the two. The opportunity was that the UN had amassed supplies of food and medical aid on the borders of Syria, outside of Syria, but wouldn't go over those borders. They wouldn't drive the trucks over until they got explicit permission from Assad, the dictator in Syria, which he wasn't giving. So the aid was there, it just wasn't being delivered, and sometimes the aid was just 15 minutes drive across the border to populations that needed it. Our theory of change, which is again another thing that we think through, is why is the action we're going to ask people to take likely or possibly going to help us achieve our goal? And with this, the UN had never had, UN agencies, humanitarian agencies, had never had a public campaign against them. We knew there was a division, there was debate going on in those agencies about whether they should go over the border or not, so there was potential there. And so we launched an action which was over Twitter and over most social media, basically with images calling the UN to drive the trucks over the border. It was done at the same time as the UN Security Council. We know there was lots of lobbying going on for them to do it. And after a period of weeks, this was not the reason why they did it, but it was definitely influential from the back channel feedback we got about what was happening in the agencies. The UN started to deliver aid over the borders of Syria. So that's kind of very, very much in a nutshell the kind of thinking that we go through as campaigners and activists. It's the skeleton. It doesn't account for the ingenuity, the imagination, the art, and the spirit that goes into these things. But I think if you can hang those things on these structures, there's a strong chance for success. So thank you.
I have excellent news for the Danish-speaking population because John's book, Small Acts of Resistance, has been published in Danish by forlaget Bøgedal called Det Stille Oprør. Thank you, John.